Hi and welcome to this episode of Hiking Back in Time. I'm Steve Sleep and I'm going to take you on a hike today out into the forest near Crowston Lake. Now we drove here through Sechelt, and to get here we traveled through Sechelt until the exit to the Big Firs Park. It's an acute right turn off the highway just before Trout Lake. It's 3 kilometers up that road, which is a fairly good gravel road until you get to Big Firs Park. And then from there, the road gets a little bit rough, and it's another 1.5 kilometers up that road. You just stay on the main road all the way up to where we are here, which is at the entrance to a trail locally known as Parback. Now we're going to start our hike here, and we're going to hike up the Parback trail, and we're eventually going to veer off onto a trail called VFR, and the trail VFR is named for that plane wreck, and it stands for Visual Flight Rules. And unfortunately, in 1952, Captain Bruce Wilson crashed his plane into the side of the mountain. He was flying an Avro Anson Mark V. It was December, so possibly bad weather had a lot to do with the fact that he crashed. Captain Wilson's 41 years old. He crashed on the day after his 41st birthday, and we're going to go and find that site. Now, anytime you visit a site that has a fatality, you should pay a lot of respect to that site. It's a grave site. When we get to the site, we'll have a look around. As a rule, we're not going to move any of the artifacts that we see or find, but we can have a look at them and explore that site. And again, we're going to show some respect for Captain Wilson, who perished in this crash on that site. So I'm going to head up the Parback Trail and to the VFR trail, and we'll meet at that next intersection. So as you hike up the Parback Trail, it doesn't take long before you come to Crowston Lake, and it's a pretty view from the trail. It's a fairly easy trail to hike. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm carrying today, and it's the same as I always carry when I go into the forest. I have my trusty hiking stick. In my pack I've got some water, a little bit of food. I know that there's cell service here, so I'm carrying a phone in case of an emergency. And because of the time of the year, I'm carrying bear spray and bear bangers today as well. I've told somebody where I'm going. They know when I'll be back, and if I don't show up, they'll know to call 911 and alert search and rescue to come and try and find me. For now, it's safe out in the forest. I got my camera guy Matt with me, and we're heading off on an adventure. Okay, I've come to a Y in the trail. Behind me, there's a sign that says Summer Trail, and that goes down to Crowston Lake. We're going to go to the right, and there's a sign up on the trail. A little further up says VFR, and that's the way we want to go. Okay, so if you're on the right trail, you'll come up a couple of switchbacks, and then you're going to see this sign off to the left-hand side. It says VFR Trail, and this sign was erected by a gentleman named Robert Allen, who was a surveyor here on the Sunshine Coast, a longtime search and rescue member, and he spent a lot of time in the outdoors. And Robert paid for this sign to be here, and it has a lot of information on it about the site and some local wildlife. This photograph here is actually a photograph of the actual plane that crashed up here on the hill. Charlie Foxtrot Golf Mike. And it was a Queen Charlotte Airlines plane, and it was a freighter. They had more than one Avro Anson Mark V, and this was the cargo plane, and they had another one that was all plush and luxury for carrying passengers. This particular Avro Anson here was restored by the people in the British Columbia Air Museum, and we're going to go have a visit to that site a little bit later on in this episode. And there's a couple of photographs of the engine parts and airplane parts that have been gathered around from people that have visited the site. And it says up here, the members of SCUM, which is the Sunshine Coast United Mountain Bikers, named the trail VFR, which in pilot's language stands for Visual Flight Rules, which in Wikipedia are described as a set of regulations under which a pilot operates an aircraft in weather conditions generally clear enough to allow the pilot to see where the aircraft is going. The pilot must be able to operate the aircraft with visual reference to the ground and by visually avoiding obstructions in other aircraft. And we suspect that wasn't quite the rule when this plane went down, and again, December 5th, weather could be a big factor in the crash of this plane. But we're going to continue a little bit further up the trail until we find the crash site, and we'll go in and have a look and see what's there. Okay, so I've hiked about half an hour from the car, and this is the entrance to the section where the plane wreck is, and I'm going to tie this little piece of orange flagging tape right up in this stick here, and it's the only marking that I'm going to put. We don't want this to be a busy site, but if you're looking for it, that will be your indicator. And I see a little piece of pipe here, and you wonder right away, is that plane wreckage or is that something from a mountain bike? But if you look at the steel on it, and if you look very carefully, you can see it says AC755 and a bunch of other numbers. It indicates that this is a piece of an aircraft. Every piece on an aircraft has a number stamped on it. So this was probably left pretty close to where it was found. In this stump, I'm going to put it back exactly where I found it, and I'm going to head up the trail. It gets a bit steep from here. It's quite a steep pitch coming up from the trail. And as we get up to this spot, we start to see some wreckage in the forest. This is probably very close to the point of impact where the plane hit the side of the hill, and you can see it's quite a steep hill. But as you work your way around from here, you start to see some wreckage. There's some metal up in the moss up there. And as I work my way around down here, I see more wreckage. There's this big metal piece here. You can see that there's threaded ends to these with holes for pins. The reason there's no material left from the rest of the plane is this plane was made almost entirely of plywood, and it was created in a big tube, and that was the fuselage. There was not a lot of metal available at the time these planes were built during the Second World War, so they had to find other options. Down in the forest bed, if you very carefully look, you start to see little signs of yellow, and there's a little bit of yellow here. And as I step back, there's yellow here, and there's some silver here. More yellow, more silver, more yellow. And this piece here, I'm just going to remove this, but I'm going to put it back, is a piece of silver. And if you look carefully, you can see some yellow paint as well. The coating on the wing they called dope. And the wing coating on this plane was made of a fabric. They covered it with dope. It's kind of like a glue. And if you look very carefully, you can actually see where the two strands of fabric were bonded together. So this is part of a wing covering that survived the fire. And I'm just going to put it right back down where I found it. And that's the way you should leave a site like this. Remember, the pilot died at this site. This is his grave site. We don't want to disturb it. So just about 30 seconds up the trail from where we found the first artifacts, there's a whole bunch of bits and pieces of the wreckage that have been gathered together by a tree here, and it's really not the right thing to do on a site like this, especially a burial site, but some well-meaning people put it all together so you can find it. But from an archaeological point of view, having the wreckage site stay intact gives them an opportunity to reconstruct what the wreckage site looked like in the first place. Now, when it's all gathered together, there's no indication as to how widespread it is. But this particular piece of material, the big round one, is a cowling from the engine. And if you look at the top, this is asbestos, this ring that goes around it, and there's an asbestos ring around here. So we really don't want to mess with this too much. We don't want to disturb the asbestos. It's best just left where it is. This is a piece of exhaust manifold, and it's made of high temperature steel, so it's stood up really well in the forest. And there's a couple of other pieces of engine parts back down in there. And these little pieces here were the way they attached wood together to metal, lots of screws, big washers on the back, and they sandwiched it in between. And the rescuers, once they'd removed the captain's body from the site, they burned the wreckage. So almost all the wood that was in this airplane is completely gone now because it was involved in a fire. But there's little bits and pieces you can still see scattered around. One kind of significant piece is this big steel piece here. And this is the main crankshaft from one of the engines. And this aircraft was powered by two 9-cylinder Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines. And it's 9 cylinders all in a big circle with a propeller, and the propeller would have attached right to the end of the spindle here. There's threads on the end with places for lock wire, so the big nut that would go on there, they'd tie it on with lock wire so it couldn't possibly come loose. And this would have been inside that engine. And the engines weren't that thick, they were quite flat, bolted to the front of the plane. And it's the same engine that you'd see in a de Havilland Beaver today. They're still in use. And you can see out the back, there's 9 holes. It's a big piece of metal, and I'm just going to put it back where I found it, but it's not probably where it was. They did remove one of the engines from the site, according to the information, but the other engine was obviously destroyed in the crash, and little bits and pieces were there. The rest of the wreckage is scattered around in the forest around me, but I took a lot of photographs of some of the other wreckage pieces that are hidden in the forest, and I took them down to the BC Aviation Museum at Pat Bay Airport in Victoria, and I had a chance to talk to Gord Bell, who is a volunteer there, and he talked a little bit about this particular crash. He found some more information for me about it, and they have a restored Avro Anson down there, and he gave me a bit of a tour of that. So if you wanted to see what this plane looked like before it had its horrible crash, stay tuned, and we'll come back in Victoria and we'll have a look at the Avro Anson that's there at the museum.
Hi, my name's Gord Bell. I'm a volunteer at the British Columbia Aviation Museum here in Victoria at the Victoria Airport. We're in our library right now. It's very extensive volumes of books in here. Mainly, I would say 99% of them dealing with aviation. Everything fiction to aircraft performance books, and non-fiction, a lot of World War II data as well. This model Anson that was involved in the accident is a Mark V Anson. There were, in BC, we used Mark 1s, 2s, and 5s. The Mark V was a bit different as it used a plywood wing, and they would use plywood for the structure of the wing, and then probably put primer coats of paint and final coats of paint to strengthen it up. And that's what you're looking at now, is probably the gray primer and the yellow top coat of the paint.
So you might guess that that plane was yellow then?
I'm guessing that it was yellow, yeah.
This shows to me several layers of paint. Can you comment on that? It looks to me like black and silver and yellow layered up like that.
Yes, the silver and the black would be a primer coat of some kind, and I'm not sure exactly the many types of aircraft that use that silver coating underneath the final coats of paint, but there might be as many as a half dozen coats, including the final coats on there to protect it.
Okay.
That to me would be the engine cowling. See the cowling here and the exhaust stacks from the engine here.
Right. Okay. Now there's since the aircraft bits were discovered, that poppy's been placed there. It's wasn't a military flight as far as you know.
No, it was a civilian flight. The records that we found on the accident, the aircraft belonged to Queen Charlotte Airlines, and it was on its way from Vancouver to Comox either Vancouver to Comox or Comox to Vancouver on a cargo hauling flight. So this aircraft, probably the seats were taken out of it, the passenger seats were taken out of it. It was hauling freight of some kind between Vancouver and Comox.
Okay, now typically Vancouver to Comox would take you over a large body of water. This was a wheeled plane,
Yes.
so the reason it would be flying over Sechelt would be to fly over the water for the shortest period of time?
Yeah, I think just to get from point to point. So they'd fly up the coast on the north of Vancouver, and then it was just a slight diversion would take it over the straits into Comox once they got past, well, even before Powell River. You know, it just sort of a leg off there.
Okay. No, that's that engine crank.
Yeah,
Nice.
crank.
Now I counted 9, which my guess would make this a Pratt & Whitney Wasp engine. The Anson that you have in your hangar is only a 7-cylinder, isn't it?
Yes, it's got a Jacobs engine in it. The Anson that's on display here at the museum is a Mark II Anson, and they've got Jacobs engines in them, and they're about a 330 horsepower engine. The later Mark V's were a Pratt & Whitney R985 engine, and they're about 450 horsepower each. So they're slightly different models.
Okay, so a large pile of debris, but that people have all sort of moved into a central location. Can you comment on what people should do when if they find a site like this, and how they should handle themselves in a situation like this?
Well, number one, whether most military sites where military aircraft have crashed are considered a historic site, and they're actually a grave site of sorts, and really nobody should be touching or moving any material around. Many of these sites people have added monuments to, and to explain what happened and where it is, but basically it's, whether it's civilian accident or military, everything should be left as is, because it's basically, in this case, it was a fatal accident. It's considered a grave site.
As is, where is?
Yeah, just leave it.
So tell me a little bit more about the Anson itself. Do you have any idea how many there were? You mentioned that they were plywood wings. They had different makeups of different Ansons and different models.
Yeah, the Mark I Anson was built, I believe all of them were built overseas. And they were, in the early part of World War II, they were used briefly, but they became obsolete very quickly at the start of World War II. They were, of course, sort of replaced by Hampton aircraft and Bolingbroke aircraft that were involved in bombing during the Battle of Britain. The Ansons a lot of them were crated up and sent to Canada and other Commonwealth countries to take part in training air crews. And in Canada, it was part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. A lot of those Ansons were used from the Mark I Ansons were used, and then they were actually constructed in Canada. The Mark IIs were constructed in Canada. The Mark I's that were originally built, there was almost 7,000 of them built. The Mark IIs, there was 1,800 built in Canada. A little bit of difference in those between the Mark I and the Mark II is that the Mark I, they had to hand crank the landing gear down, and it was 108 cranks to get the landing gear down. The Mark IIs finally came out with hydraulic landing gear, and they didn't have to do that. So there was 800 Mark IIs there with the Jacobs engines that we will see. The Mark V's, they were built in Canada as well. There was almost 1,100 of those Mark V's built.
Okay, now you found some information about this specific crash. Maybe you can share that with us.
Sure. Good old internet, we Googled the registration of this aircraft. We found basic information in our library here on the accident, and at least it gave us a registration of the aircraft. And once we were able to Google that registration, we pinned down an aviation accident website that explains thousands and thousands of accidents. So we found this one, and the information in it was very good. It's one page of information, and at least we found out the company. We found out the pilot's name and what the purpose of the flight was and exactly when it happened. They didn't discover the accident. They knew the plane was missing, but they didn't discover the accident for 3 or 4 days after the crash, and the RCAF were involved in that. So that's the kind of information we got from the internet.
Okay, and from that information, the crash was what time of year?
I'm gonna have to go to the notes here. It was December 5th, 1952 was the date of the accident.
Okay.
And it wasn't found until I think the 8th or the 9th of December. So, December 9th they found the wreckage.
Okay, so there's no information there as to the cause of the crash, but guessing from that time of year?
Probably weather. If he went into a 2,000-foot hillside, which is roughly 1,800 feet around Half Moon Bay, north of Sechelt, is that it was probably weather related, and he flew into IMC, or instrument meteorological conditions, and hit the hillside.
All right. Can we go have a look at the plane?
Sure.
Great.
You bet. This is the Jacobs engine on the Mark II, and it's somewhat different from the Mark V wreckage that we saw. You'll notice the exhaust stacks on it are quite a bit different. Where they had those wraparound exhaust stacks on the Pratt & Whitney engine, they're not the same as on this fella. That shaft that we were looking at with the marks in it would be behind the propeller here, going into the engine. On this Mark II, you'll see that the nose of the aircraft, they would have room for either bomb aiming training or photographic cameras in here. The nose is actually metal on this front, but basically the whole fuselage to the back is a fabric on wooden rib. It's like a drum. So everything to the very back of the airplane, including the tail, would be that fabric. And the places that required strengthening would be metal, probably aircraft aluminum. This is a little bit tougher, you'll still see the ribs in the fabric there, but it's a tougher material than just the fabric that you see in the fuselage. You can hear the difference here. It's fairly tough. It could be lots of coats of primer paint and final coats of paint on that. As compared to the aileron here that we're looking at, which is pretty light fabric on there. Same thing here, it's kind of strengthened material. The area with the rivets on the head of there is likely the fuel tank, so that's why it would be made out of metal and fuel tank vents on it. Again, around the engine, the rear portion of the engine is that fabric, rib and fabric material. Very, very delicate, actually. On our particular model here, was like the pilot training during World War II, pilot navigator training. You see the navigator seat in front of us here. And they actually had bombardier training as well from these machines. They had mock bombs on them. Again, all the way to the back is this fabric type material. It is actually, yep. When Queen Charlotte Airlines obtained these aircraft, I believe they bought them surplus from the military, and there was about a dozen of them that were sitting in Abbotsford. So they transferred those dozen airplanes from Abbotsford to Vancouver, and then redid them into civil configuration where they put seats in them, took out this military stuff and put the seats in there. I'm not sure. I'd have to check, but I'm guessing you could probably fit 9 in, at least in there. The provincial government air services, who did a lot of surveying and aerial photography back, starting after World War II, they were doing inventory and aerial photography of the province. They bought a number of these things, the provincial government, and used them as transport and for aerial photography as well into the 1950s. Right over here, inside below the cockpit and inside the engine, you see a couple of doors there. Those would be practice bombing. They have practice bombs that they'd use for bombardier training. The BC Aviation Museum is a non-profit society. It's located at the Victoria Airport. We're not hard to find, and anybody that wants to pop in and see our collection of aircraft and engines and displays are most welcome.